Commander Li Wan was sleeping in his quarters when the emergency alarm screamed through the corridors of the UES Inchin. The ship's artificial gravity made his feet hit the cold metal floor as he rushed to the bridge. It was 4 in the morning. Ship time, and emergencies at this hour usually meant someone was dying. The bridge crew was already at their stations when Wan arrived. The main holographic display was crackling with static, trying to establish a connection across impossible distances. When the image finally stabilized, Juan saw something that made his blood run cold. The alien on the screen was Veltar, a council representative he had met during the peace negotiations 2 years ago. Back then Veltar had been calm and dignified, his blue skin smooth and perfect like polished marble. Now, that same skin was covered in dark patches that pulsed with fear. In all his years dealing with different alien species, Juan had never seen one look so terrified. "Human command, we need immediate assistance." Veltar's voice was shaking. His translator was working overtime to convert his panic into words humans could understand. "The Devourers have consumed the Theta Sector. 17 worlds are gone. Our fleets cannot even slow them down." Juan felt his stomach drop. 17 worlds meant billions of lives. The Theta Sector was one of the most populated areas in the galaxy, home to 3 different alien civilizations that had been thriving for thousands of years. These were not primitive societies either. The Krillins alone had technology that made human ships look like wooden boats compared to aircraft carriers. The tactical data began streaming across Juan's personal display. Numbers, coordinates, battle reports, all painting the same horrible picture. The Velkan Empire, masters of energy weapons and shields, had lasted exactly 4 days. The Krillin Armada, with their 3,000 ship fleet and quantum torpedoes, had been destroyed in less than a week. The Zephyr Collective, known throughout the galaxy for their defensive strategies, had simply vanished overnight. What made it worse was how complete the destruction was. When pirates attacked, they left wreckage behind. When conquerors invaded, they occupied planets and enslaved populations. These Devourers left nothing at all. No debris floating in space, no radiation signatures, no distress calls from survivors. Just empty darkness, where entire star systems used to exist. "Understood," Representative Juan replied, keeping his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. "We're en route." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in uncomfortable silence. Juan could feel his crew staring at him, waiting for orders that might be sending them all to their deaths. Lieutenant Park Min, his communications officer, was the first to speak up. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Sir, our entire fleet is only 200 ships. The Krillin Armada alone had over 3,000 vessels, and they were completely destroyed." Juan looked around the bridge at his crew. These were good people, volunteers who had signed up to explore the stars and maybe fight some pirates. They had never imagined facing something that could destroy civilizations in days. Parkman was right to be concerned. 200 human ships against an enemy that had crushed 3,000 aliens. Vessels seemed like mathematical suicide. But that was exactly why the aliens had called humanity for help. Not because humans were the strongest or had the best technology. The council species had evolved on peaceful garden worlds where the biggest danger was maybe a thunderstorm. Earth was different. Earth was a planet that tried to kill everything living on it every single day. Humans had learned to fight impossible odds because on their homeworld, impossible odds were just Tuesday. Juan activated the ship-wide communication system. His voice would now reach every human on every ship in the fleet, from the newest recruit to the most experienced veteran. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of their entire species. "All hands, prepare for combat operations. We're humanity's shield now." Captain Kim Soo stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately knew something was very wrong. The Council's emergency station, normally a place of calm diplomatic discussions, had turned into complete chaos. The massive command center was packed with alien representatives from dozens of different species, and every single one of them was panicking in their own unique way. The tall, insect-like mantids were clicking their mandibles rapidly, a sound that meant extreme distress in their culture. The floating jellyfish creatures from Aquarius Prime were flashing bright red warning colors, their translucent bodies pulsing with fear. The rock-skinned granite people were making deep rumbling sounds that shook the floor, while the bird-like Aryan delegates were shrieking in harmonies that hurt human ears. Ambassador Yoon Da rushed over to Kim Soo, her translator device working overtime to process all the different alien languages being spoken at once. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes showing she had been awake for days trying to make sense of the reports flooding in from across the galaxy. "Captain, thank goodness you're here," she said, pulling him toward a quieter corner of the command center. "I've been trying to piece together what we're facing, but honestly, it's terrifying." She activated her personal datapad and began scrolling through the battle reports. The entities phase through energy shields like they don't even exist. Our plasma weapons hurt them at first, but within minutes they adapt and become completely immune. Worse than that, they seem to predict our tactical responses before we even make them. Kim Soo frowned as he read the reports. These weren't just random attacks. There was a pattern here, an intelligence behind the destruction that made it even more frightening. "What do the Council's military experts think?" Yoon Da laughed bitterly. "The Council's best military minds are completely baffled. Most of these species haven't fought a real war in centuries. Their idea of military strategy is politely asking pirates to please stop stealing their cargo ships." The main display screen activated, showing battle recordings from the destroyed fleets. Kim Soo watched carefully as the Devourers moved through space. They flowed like liquid darkness, bending and shifting around enemy positions with impossible grace. When the alien ships tried to create defensive formations, the Devourers simply flowed around them like water flowing around stones in a river. But something about the way they moved triggered a memory in Kim Soo's mind. Growing up in Busan, he had spent countless hours diving in the dangerous coastal waters. The ocean around his hometown was full of predators that had learned to hunt in the deep, dark places where normal fish couldn't survive. "They hunt like deep-sea predators," he muttered to himself, then spoke louder as the realization hit him. "Ambassador, tell the Council we need full authority over defensive operations, and get me Admiral Choi on the comm." The alien representatives nearby heard his words and exchanged uncertain glances. The tall mantid delegate, whose name was something unpronounceable involving clicks and whistles, approached them with obvious hesitation. "Captain Kim Soo," the mantid said through its translator, "with all due respect to your species, humanity has barely mastered interstellar travel. Your ships are primitive compared to our technology. How do you expect to succeed where we have failed?" Kim Soo understood their concern. Humanity had only joined the galactic community 20 years ago, and their technology was indeed basic compared to species that had been traveling between stars for thousands of years. The aliens had faster ships, stronger shields, more powerful weapons, and computers that could calculate battle strategies in microseconds. But there was something the aliens didn't understand about humans. Earth was not like their peaceful garden worlds, where the biggest danger was a thunderstorm, or maybe an earthquake every few decades. Earth was a death world, a planet so hostile that most council members needed full environmental suits just to breathe its air. Every human had grown up fighting for survival against a world that wanted to kill them. They had learned to adapt, to think creatively, to find ways to win against impossible odds, because that was the only way to stay alive on their home world. "Ambassador," Kim Soo said quietly, "explain to them that sometimes the best weapon against a perfect predator is another predator who learned to hunt in hell." Admiral Choi Jun walked into the Grand Council chamber like she was entering a funeral. The massive room was designed to impress visitors with its soaring crystal walls and floating platforms, but today it felt more like a tomb. Representatives from hundreds of alien species sat in their designated areas, their faces showing the kind of despair that comes from watching your entire civilization face extinction. Choi Jun had seen that look before, back on Earth during the climate wars, when entire cities were swallowed by rising seas. But this was different. These aliens had never experienced real desperation. Their worlds were safe, their technology advanced, their lives comfortable. They had no idea how to fight when everything seemed hopeless. The Admiral's weathered face showed no emotion as she approached the central platform. At 62 years old, she had scars from 3 different wars and eyes that had seen too much death. Her uniform was simple compared to the elaborate robes and ceremonial armor worn by the alien delegates, but something about her presence made the entire chamber fall silent. She activated the holographic display without ceremony. A map of the galaxy appeared in the air, showing the advancing devourer forces as red dots moving toward populated systems. The aliens leaned forward in their seats, desperate to hear some miracle solution that would save them all. We position human fleets here, and here, Choi Jen said, pointing to positions directly between the devourers and the civilian populations. Her voice was calm and matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. Mobile defensive screens. We don't try to win. We buy time for evacuations. The chamber erupted in confused chatter. The aliens had expected some brilliant tactical maneuver, some advanced human technology they didn't know about. Instead, they were hearing what sounded like a suicide mission described in the most casual way possible. Council Elder Thixon, an ancient creature whose tentacles had been writhing with anxiety for days, could not contain his horror. His voice trembled as he spoke through his translator. Admiral, you're placing your forces directly in their path? Our computers have run the calculations 1,000 times. The mathematical probability of survival is essentially 0. Choi Jun turned to look at him directly, and for a moment, the alien representative felt like he was staring into the eyes of a predator. Correct, she replied without the slightest hesitation. But the probability of civilian evacuation success increases to 87%. That's acceptable. Up in the observation deck, Lieutenant Colonel Namru watched the alien faces and almost laughed at their expressions. These beings looked like someone had just told them that water was actually poison. They were staring at Admiral Choi Jun like she had grown a second head or started speaking in ancient dead languages. Namru understood their confusion. These aliens came from worlds where danger meant a minor equipment malfunction or maybe a small asteroid heading toward an uninhabited moon. The idea of deliberately choosing certain death to save strangers was completely outside their understanding. To them, a 0% survival rate was a calculation error, something that meant the mission was impossible and should be abandoned immediately. To humans who had grown up on Earth, where every day brought new ways to die, certain death was just Tuesday. It was another obstacle to overcome, another problem to solve, another sacrifice that might be necessary. The chamber remained silent as the implications sank in. The aliens were slowly realizing that they were asking an entire species to commit suicide for people they had never met, from worlds they had never seen. Admiral Choi Jun looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every delegate who dared to look back at her. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of every human who had ever died protecting others. My people understand something you don't, she said quietly. Sometimes the best victory is not about living to see tomorrow. Sometimes the best victory is making sure others live to see tomorrow instead. The amber sky of Kepler 7 looked beautiful that morning, like liquid gold stretching from horizon to horizon. But Major Seo Han wasn't admiring the view. He was watching the last civilian transport ships disappear into the atmosphere, carrying millions of alien refugees to safety. Each ship that left meant fewer people would die when the Devourers arrived. The planet below was chaos. Escape pods were launching from every city, filling the sky like metallic raindrops falling upward. Alien families clutched their belongings as they ran toward evacuation points, their faces showing the kind of terror that comes from facing something beyond imagination. Most of these beings had never experienced war, never seen death on this scale. SEO Han checked his rifle's power cell and looked out over his defensive positions. 300 human soldiers were spread across the planet's surface, dug into trenches and bunkers that they had built in the past 18 hours. It wasn't much against an enemy that had destroyed entire civilizations, but it was what they had. Margin Kang. Status report. He called into his communication device. The response came back immediately. Steady and professional, despite the circumstances. Third platoon is dug in at the northern ridge, sir. Lieutenant O has the heavy weapons positioned in the valley approach. We've got overlapping fields of fire and backup positions prepared. Seo Han nodded, even though Kong couldn't see him. His soldiers knew what they were doing. They had trained for situations like this, though none of them had ever imagined facing an enemy quite like the Devourers. Good work, Sergeant. Remember, we're not trying to win this fight. We just need to buy time for the evacuations to finish. Understood, sir. If those things want this world, they'll have to go through us first. The communication ended, leaving Seo Han alone with his thoughts. In the distance, he could see the last evacuation ships climbing toward the stars. The alien civilians would be safe soon, carried away to distant worlds where they could rebuild their lives. That was what mattered. The Devourers appeared at the edge of the solar system like a nightmare made real. They looked like living shadows, their forms constantly shifting between solid matter and pure energy. Even from space, they radiated a wrongness that made human instruments struggle to focus on them properly. Within hours, they had crossed the impossible distance from the system's edge to planetary orbit. They moved faster than any ship humanity had ever built, flowing through space like liquid darkness. When they began descending through the atmosphere, they came in writhing masses that blocked out entire sections of the amber sky. SEO. Han raised his rifle as the first Devourers touched the ground. They were beautiful and terrible at the same time, their bodies flowing like water while crackling with energy that hurt to look at directly. Intelligence reports had said conventional weapons were useless against them, that only the most advanced alien technology could even slow them down. All units, open fire, Seo Han shouted into his communicator. The human soldiers opened fire with everything they had. Bullets, plasma bolts, explosive shells, even old-fashioned grenades flew toward the advancing device. According to every tactical analysis, these primitive weapons should have passed right through the energy beings without causing any damage. Instead, something incredible happened. The Devourers stumbled. They flickered between their energy and solid forms, struggling to maintain stability as human weapons found their marks. The creatures that had flowed effortlessly through space battles seemed confused by the chaotic, unpredictable environment of a planetary surface. The humans pressed their advantage, using every dirty trick they had learned growing up on Earth. They collapsed buildings to create obstacles, used the planet's own weather against the invaders, and fought with the kind of desperate creativity that only comes from a lifetime of surviving on a world that wants to kill you. For 72 hours, 300 humans held an entire planet against forces that had consumed civilizations. They fought without sleep, without reinforcements, without hope of survival. When the rescue ships finally arrived, they found Seo Han's battered survivors still fighting, still buying precious time for others to escape. The ruins of Firebase Charlie looked like the end of the world. Smoke drifted through broken concrete walls, and the smell of burned metal hung heavy in the air. Private First Class Bay 1 crawled through the debris, his medical kit clutched tightly in his hands as he searched for survivors from the latest Devourer attack. He found Corporal Jiang Mi pinned under a collapsed beam, her leg twisted at an angle that made Bei Wan's stomach turn. Blood was pooling beneath her, and her face was pale from shock, but she was alive, and that was what mattered. "Hold still, Corporal," Bei Wan said as he began cutting away her torn uniform to reach the wound. "I'm going to get you out of here." As he worked to stop the bleeding, something caught his attention from the corner of his eye. A devourer entity was writhing on the ground nearby, its normally fluid form flickering between energy and solid matter. The creature that should have been invincible was clearly dying, its body struggling to maintain cohesion. Bei Wan had seen plenty of wounded soldiers in his time as a medic, but he had never seen a dying devourer before. Nobody had, because until now, nobody thought they could actually be killed. He reached for his field recorder with one bloody hand while continuing to treat Jiang Mi with the other. Field recording, Day 3 of the Kepler-7 defense. He spoke quietly into the device. "I'm observing a wounded devourer entity, approximately 3 meters from my position. The creature appears to be losing structural integrity." He watched carefully as the entity's form flickered more rapidly. Each time it tried to shift into its energy state, it seemed to struggle, like a drowning person trying to reach the surface of a deep pool. "They're not adapting," Bei Wan realized suddenly, his voice rising with excitement. "They're suffocating. These things evolved in the vacuum of space. They can't handle atmospheric pressure, gravity, environmental chaos." The implications hit him like a thunderbolt. The devourers weren't some invincible force of nature. They were specialized predators, perfectly designed for space combat, but struggling to function in the chaotic environment of a planetary surface. Every breath of air, every shift in gravity, every unpredictable element of planetary warfare was like poison to them. Hours later, Captain Lim Su sat in the medical bay of the frigate Seoul, reviewing Bei Wan's field recording for the 5th time. Around her, wounded soldiers from the Kepler-7 defense were receiving treatment, their bodies battered but their spirits surprisingly high for people who had just survived the impossible. The pattern was becoming clear as she studied the combat footage from across the planet. In space, the devourers moved like liquid lightning, effortlessly maintaining their energy forms and flowing around any obstacle. But on planetary surfaces, especially when facing unpredictable human tactics, they struggled to maintain stability. "They're like deep-sea fish brought to the surface," Lim Su muttered to herself. "Perfect in their element, but dying outside of it." She activated her communication console and connected directly to Fleet Command. Priority message for Admiral Choi Jun. "We've discovered a critical weakness in devourer capabilities." Within minutes, she was speaking directly to the Admiral, who listened intently as Lim Su explained their discovery. The alien fleets had tried to fight the devourers in space, where the entities were strongest. Humans had been forced to fight them on planets, where they were weakest. "Get this information to every ground unit immediately," Admiral Choi Jun ordered, "and send word to all human forces throughout the galaxy." Lim Su drafted the message carefully, knowing that these words might determine whether humanity survived the next few days. "To all human forces, the enemy isn't invincible, just specialized. Fight dirty, fight desperate, and use everything our homeworld taught us about surviving in hell." The message spread through human communication networks like wildfire. From the ice mines of Europa to the desert colonies of Mars, every human soldier received the same instructions. Earth had been a harsh teacher, forcing humanity to adapt to every conceivable hostile environment. Now those brutal lessons would become the galaxy's salvation on 1,000 different worlds. Human soldiers read the message and smiled grimly. They had grown up fighting gravity, atmosphere, weather, and terrain that wanted to kill them, against an enemy that couldn't handle environmental chaos. Humans were the perfect weapon, Colonel An Bin stood on the bridge of the destroyer, Daegu, watching his tactical display like a chess master studying the board before the final move. Across 3 entire star systems, human ships were positioning themselves in what looked like complete chaos to outside observers. But An Bin could see the pattern, the method behind what appeared to be madness. Each vessel was not positioned for maximum firepower or optimal defensive coverage like traditional military doctrine taught. Instead, they were creating something far more valuable against an enemy like the They were building overlapping fields of chaos and unpredictability, turning empty space into a nightmare maze that would force the energy beings to struggle just to maintain their forms. The bridge crew worked quietly around him, their faces showing the kind of grim determination that comes from knowing you are about to die for something important. These were not the best ships in the human fleet, not the newest or most advanced. They were volunteer crews on aging vessels, people who had stepped forward when the call went out for someone to hold the line. Contact. Communications Officer Moon Ka suddenly called out, her voice cutting through the bridge's quiet tension. Devourer swarm, approaching the Arcturus Gate, range approximately 2 million kilometers, and closing fast. An Bin felt his heart rate increase, but his voice remained steady. This was the moment they had been preparing for, the reason 300 human ships had spread themselves across 3 star systems like seeds in the wind. All ships, implement barrier protocol, he announced into the fleet communications. His words were being heard on every human vessel within range, carrying orders that would determine whether millions of civilians lived or died. Remember, we're not trying to win this fight. We're trying to make them work for every meter. The battle began like an ancient siege from Earth's history, but fought across the vast distances of space. The Devourers came forward in their usual, flowing formation, expecting to sweep through the human positions like they had done to every other fleet they had encountered. But instead of clean battle lines, they found chaos. Human vessels immediately began using everything around them as weapons. Ships that had been positioned near asteroid fields suddenly started pushing the floating rocks into the path of the advancing Devourers. Damaged freighters that should have been scrapped years ago were deliberately crashed into each other, creating floating debris fields that forced the energy beings to navigate around solid obstacles. The Daegu fired its engines and dove toward a cluster of space junk left over from an old mining operation. An Bin watched as his crew turned their ship into a battering ram, pushing the metal wreckage into a wall of chaotic obstacles. Other ships were doing the same thing across the battlefield, creating a maze of spinning debris and unpredictable hazards. "They're slowing down, sir," Moon Ka reported with excitement in her voice. "The Devourers are having trouble maintaining formation through all the debris." An Bin nodded grimly. This was exactly what they had hoped for. The energy beings were struggling to phase through the chaotic environment, their perfect coordination breaking down as they encountered obstacle after obstacle, but the cost was becoming apparent. Human ships were deliberately ramming into Devourer formations, their crews choosing certain death to take as many enemies with them as possible. Entire squadrons disappeared in brilliant flashes of light as their reactors overloaded. But each sacrifice created more debris, more chaos, more problems for the advancing enemy. The battle raged for hours. Human vessels turned themselves into mobile fortresses, using their own wreckage as cover and their dying ships as weapons. The Devourers, accustomed to flowing effortlessly through clean space battles, found themselves trapped in a 3-dimensional maze of spinning metal and unpredictable hazards. Behind the human shield wall, something beautiful was happening. Alien evacuation fleets were successfully moving millions of civilians to safety, their transports protected by the sacrifice of Earth's children. The galaxy's most peaceful species were learning what it meant to be defended by warriors from a world that bred fighters. The cost was devastating. Entire human squadrons vanished in seconds, their crews dying unknown and unremembered except by their comrades. But the strategy worked. For every human ship that fell, Dozens of devourers were destroyed or damaged, their perfect forms struggling against the environmental chaos that humans created naturally. Admiral Song-min walked through the research bay of the battleship Gwangju, like a man visiting his own grave. The massive room was filled with pieces of devourer technology that his people had managed to salvage from the battlefields. Strange crystalline structures that seemed to bend, light around them, and emit sounds that made human ears ache. Dr. Runa looked up from her workstation as the Admiral approached. Her face was gaunt from weeks of sleepless nights, her eyes bloodshot from staring at alien symbols that hurt to look at directly. Around her, the remains of her research team worked frantically at computers and analysis equipment, trying to unlock secrets that might save what was left of the galaxy. "Admiral, thank goodness you're here," Runa said, gesturing toward the central display, where a three-dimensional model of devourer anatomy rotated slowly. "We've finally figured out how they do it, how they phase between dimensions." Song-min studied the display carefully. The model showed the internal structure of a devourer entity, with pulsing nodes of energy connected by streams of what looked like liquid starlight. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like looking at the blueprint of a nightmare. "These are dimensional anchoring systems," Juna explained, pointing to the glowing nodes. "They allow the entities to exist partially in our space and partially in another dimension. That's why our weapons pass right through them most of the time, and why they can move so effortlessly through solid matter." The implications were staggering. The devourers weren't just energy beings, they were interdimensional predators who could shift between realities at will. No wonder the alien fleets had been helpless against them. "We can force them back into normal space," Runa continued, her voice gaining excitement despite her exhaustion. "But only for brief periods, and only with coordinated quantum disruption across multiple anchor points simultaneously." Song-min felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. "How many ships would we need for something like that?" Runa's face fell, and she looked down at her hands. "For Operation Earthstorm, every vessel we have left, sir. And even then, it's essentially a suicide mission. The power requirements alone would overload most of our reactors." The Admiral was quiet for a long moment, considering what she had told him. The human fleet had been reduced to fewer than 50 operational ships after weeks of defensive battles. Most of those were damaged, their crews exhausted, and their supplies running low. What Runa was proposing would require every single vessel to coordinate perfectly while pushing their systems beyond safe limits. "But it would work?" he asked finally. "In theory, yes. If we can hit their dimensional anchors at exactly the same moment across multiple points, we can trap them in normal space long enough for conventional weapons to destroy them. But the timing has to be perfect, and there's no room for error." Min activated his personal communication device and connected to the fleet-wide network. His voice would now reach every surviving human ship scattered across the galaxy. From massive battleships to tiny patrol vessels that were barely holding together. "All human forces, this is Admiral Song-min," he began, his words carrying the weight of their species' last desperate gamble. "For months, we've been running, defending, buying time for others to escape. Today, that changes. Today we stop running. Today we hunt the hunters." The message spread through space at light speed, reaching battered crews who had given up hope of ever seeing their homes again, on damaged ships held together by spare parts and determination. Human soldiers received their final orders and felt something they hadn't experienced in weeks: the chance to strike back. "Operation Earthstorm begins in 6 hours, Song-min continued. "We're going to use captured alien technology, combined with everything we've learned about fighting these things. Every ship, every crew, every human in this fleet has one job: hit their dimensional anchors simultaneously and force them into normal space where we can kill them." The plan was insane. requiring perfect coordination across impossible distances, while using technology they barely understood. But it was also typically human, taking the enemy's greatest strength and finding a way to turn it into weakness. At 1400 hours, Coordinated Universal Time, the counterattack began. It would determine whether humanity's sacrifice had any meaning, beyond noble defiance, or whether Earth's children could actually save a galaxy that had never believed in them. The bridge of the Guangzhou shuddered violently as another explosion rocked the ship. Admiral Song Min gripped his command chair as the lights flickered and sparks flew from damaged control panels. Through the main view screen, he could see a devourer entity materializing directly in front of them. Its normally flowing form suddenly solid and vulnerable in normal space. Target acquired. Lieutenant Ko shouted over the noise of alarms and emergency systems. Her fingers flew across her tactical console as she coordinated the killing blow. All weapons, fire. The battleship's main guns opened fire in unison, sending streams of plasma and explosive shells into the trapped devourer. For the first time in months of fighting, the creature couldn't phase away from the attack. It writhed in obvious pain as human weapons tore through its solid form, its beautiful energy patterns flickering and dying. Target destroyed. Admiral Ko, unreported, with exhausted satisfaction. But then she paused, her eyes widening as new readings appeared on her screens. Sir, we're detecting massive dimensional collapse across all enemy positions. Songmin felt his heart racing as he processed what she was telling him. Across the entire battlefield, the devourer swarms were being stripped of their phasing abilities. The coordinated quantum disruption was working better than they had dared to hope, trapping the entities in normal space where human weapons could actually hurt them. The tide of battle was turning. Human fleets that had spent months learning to fight these seemingly invincible entities were now finding them mortal, destructible, and finally defeatable. Ships that had been running defensive actions for weeks suddenly found themselves able to go on the offensive. But as Songmin watched the tactical display, he began to understand the true cost of their victory. The green dots representing human ships were disappearing one by one, each loss representing hundreds of brave souls who would never see Earth again. Of humanity's original defense fleet of 200 vessels, fewer than 30 remained operational. On his personal communication screen, he could see final messages from dying ships. Captain Li from the destroyer Busan had rammed her damaged vessel into a cluster of devourers, buying precious seconds for other ships to escape. The crew of the frigate Seoul had overloaded their reactor to create a massive explosion that took out an entire enemy formation. Most painful of all was the message from Admiral Choi Jun. Songmin watched the recording of her final transmission, sent just moments before she deliberately crashed her flagship into the largest devourer swarm. Her weathered face showed no fear, only the grim satisfaction of a soldier completing her mission. "Tell Earth we held the line," she had said simply, before cutting the transmission. Victory was theirs, but it felt hollow when measured against the cost. Entire squadrons had vanished in brilliant flashes of light, their crews dying unknown and unremembered, except by their surviving comrades. These had been volunteers all, people who had stepped forward when the galaxy needed protectors, on countless alien worlds. Populations that had never experienced war watched the aftermath through their communication networks. They saw humanity's scattered survivors limping home in damaged ships, their hulls scarred by battle and their crews reduced to skeleton strength. For the first time, these peaceful species began to truly understand what their protectors had given up. The humans hadn't just risked their lives, they had willingly thrown them away to save strangers from worlds they had never seen. It was a level of sacrifice that most alien minds struggled to comprehend. The devourer threat was over, but the galaxy would never forget the price of their salvation. In the grand halls of the council, alien representatives spoke in hushed tones about the courage of Deathworld species, about warriors who fought with desperate determination, not for conquest or glory, but simply because others needed protecting Earths. Children had saved the galaxy, but so few of them would ever see home again. 6 months after the last devourer fell silent in the cold darkness of space, Captain Park so stood in the Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Council and felt completely out of place. The massive chamber was designed to impress visitors with its soaring crystal walls and floating platforms, but to her it felt more like a museum than a place where real decisions were made. The hall was packed with representatives from hundreds of different species, all present for what the council was calling a historic moment. Aliens who had spent their entire lives in peaceful garden worlds sat alongside beings who had never seen combat until the Devourer crisis. They were all here to witness the formal establishment of something that had never existed before in galactic history. The Human Defense Corps stopped Park, so adjusted her dress uniform uncomfortably. The formal ceremony felt strange after months of emergency deployments and desperate battles. Her hands, scarred from repairing damaged equipment under enemy fire, looked out of place, holding the ceremonial documents that would make humanity the galaxy's official protectors. Council Elder Thixon approached the central podium, his ancient tentacles moving with the dignity that came from centuries of diplomatic service. When he spoke, his voice carried across the chamber with the weight of historical importance. "We have learned that some threats require warriors forged in chaos," he began, his words being translated into hundreds of different languages simultaneously. "We have learned that survival sometimes demands sacrifice beyond calculation, courage beyond reason, and dedication beyond our understanding." Ambassador Yoon Diaz stood nearby, translating the various alien speeches that followed. Dignitary after dignitary rose to speak of humanity's courage, their sacrifice, their willingness to die for strangers. The words were beautiful and formal, full of the kind of diplomatic language that made everything sound noble and clean. But Park so barely listened. Her thoughts remained with the friends who would never see this moment, the crews who had chosen certain death so others might live. She thought about Admiral Choi Jun, who had rammed her flagship into a devourer swarm rather than retreat. She remembered Captain Lee from the destroyer Busan, who had used her dying ship as a weapon to buy seconds for civilian evacuations. The ceremony continued around her, but her mind was elsewhere, remembering the faces of people who had become heroes, not because they wanted glory, but because someone had to stand in the way of monsters. These aliens spoke of humanity's courage like it was something magical, but Park so knew the truth. Her people hadn't been brave because they were special. They had been brave because the alternative was watching innocents die. A priority alert chimed on her personal communicator, cutting through her thoughts. Park so glanced down at the device and felt her stomach drop. New crisis reports were coming in from the Outer Rim sectors. Emergency transmissions from colonies under attack by something the preliminary reports couldn't even identify properly. It was a different threat than the Devourers, but the pattern was familiar. Peaceful worlds under attack, local defense forces overwhelmed, civilian populations in desperate need of protection. The galaxy was calling for help again, and there was only one species that the Council trusted to answer. Park so smiled grimly as she reviewed the deployment orders that were already appearing on her screen. The ceremony was still going on around her, aliens making speeches about peace and cooperation. But she was already thinking about ship deployments and supply lines. The galaxy had learned an important lesson during the Devourer crisis, when civilization faced extinction, when the impossible became reality and the unthinkable started happening. The call didn't go out to the most advanced species with their perfect technology and calculated responses. The call went out to the scarred warriors from the death world called Earth, to the stubborn humans who had learned to fight impossible odds because their homeworld had taught them that impossible was just another word for Tuesday. They were humanity's children, forged in the chaos of a world that tried to kill them every day. And no matter how many times the galaxy needed saving, no matter how hopeless the odds, or how certain the death, they would always answer that call, because that's what humans did.